leave the words to Daniela and Alvaro. So the school, the architectural school in Valparaiso has been founded in 1952 by architects, artists and poets. And they started from a radical vision of architecture contaminated with arts and poetry. In 1964, they wrote a collective poem called Amereida that comes from the word America and Eneide, because they feel the need to put basis for a cultural and poetic foundation of the continent, as Enea did on the southern Italian coasts. And so they start doing this trip called Travessia, that has been a foundational trip all along the South American continent, and little by little, from Patagonia to the heart of the South America, that is in Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia. They did little or big, or let's say light architectural or artistic installation, always starting from the poetry, from the poetical word. And another important thing is that in 1967, they founded the Ciudad Abierta, the open city, that is an incredible place in the middle of sandy dunes by the ocean. That is an open air laboratory where poetic word, foundational act and radical architecture create pavilion and architecture as well, and is where students and professors used to study, create and live. And another important thing, and ronda means all around, a circle, because the creation is always collective and always start from the poetic word that should open. And then the architects and the others try to bring the poetic word on earth, trying to create form and shapes. And since 1984, the school started with the program of Travessia, also with students, and they are still doing till now. So this is a little introduction of a very, very big and very deep way of interpreting architecture and design. And so now I leave the word to Daniela and Alvaro.
Thank you, Silvia, for the nice introduction. We will go a little bit deeper on all the topics that you spoke about. And thank you also to the whole curatorial team who are organizing this cycle of conferences. I don't know if I should start to share my screen now. Perhaps it's good. So, okay. Voila. Is it good? Yes?
Perfecto.
Okay. Good. So, as you say, like, I'm Daniela, industrial designer. Alvaro here, it's a professor of architecture, and we are both conducting our research now in l'Université Libre de Bruxelles, in the Faculty of Architecture in Brussels, in Belgium. And what is interesting about us is that we have this kind of like a strong background as professors from the School of Valparaiso, where we are still working and we are still very engaged. We want to say that everything that we will speak about today is not something that comes from us. Instead, it's something that comes from a bigger culture or a bigger school culture. And we are just here like to pass some ideas and to reflect on these ideas. So what is interesting about our school in Chile is that we have a strong background in pedagogies that involve learning by doing and situated learning, and also that they are really interweaved with poetry. So we have explored the different practices, and it's not something new for us, it's not something recent, as you say before. As Silvia said before, it's something that we have developed for more than 60 years in a collective way. So.
Yes, today we find interesting to share with you some aspect of what we call the culture of the school that is developed together with architects, designers, artists and poets. And we want to discuss that how this culture has been extended from the classroom or the aula to the South American continent. That's the reason that this lecture the name is From the Aula to the Continent, Growing a Geo-poetic Culture in Design or Architecture.
So we consider that some of the questions targeted in the seminar that you organized, that you presented, which are oriented to reveal the current metamorphosis of architects and designers and how they have to face different territories, different places, different cultures, is something that we have tried to encourage in our school, based on the value that we give to this direct experience or this direct encounter with the different situations as the foundations that we use to deploy or develop the disciplinary field of architecture and the disciplinary actions that we take. We also believe in the school that the university should be a place to speculate and to encourage these kind of practices and to explore the sort of connections that architects can deploy and can develop towards the territories, the materials, the different cultures, different inhabitants, as a way to nourish our practice, but also as a way to nourish our spirit. Consequently, there are three aspects that Silvia mentioned before that we wanted to share with you about the school that we want to stress today. First is that there is a co-creation between poetry and design disciplines that transcends architecture for us. This link with poetry contribute to questions and rethink constantly about the boundaries of the discipline of architecture and design, and allows us to expand the limits, maybe, or the traditional limits of the discipline. For us in the school, the practice of architecture is interweaved with other disciplines and also with other crafts, we could say with different crafts, because in the school, like the school is not only a school of architecture, it's also a school of industrial design, a school of graphic design. We have poets, which are professors, we have artists, sculptors, and it's a mix that permits to try to deploy these interconnections and our geopoetic culture.
The second aspect that we want to present today is the idea of growing a geopoetic culture in design. We understand culture, the concept culture, as the shared meaning that grows through experiences, learning, and discovery in a community. And in Valparaiso, we grow this culture based on a geopoetic fundamentals and based on pursue the unity between life, work, and study. And also we want to emphasize that we interpret this geopoetic approach as the commitment to build a unique relationship between poetry and situated learning actions in design. And through this action that we're going to present today, emerge this living, working, and study that is placed in different geographical contexts that from Valparaiso to the South American continent. So the third aspect that we will stress today is this idea to go to the aula to the continent that is developed in three learning spaces that is in this image. And these three spaces that are presented today are, the idea is to expand these conventional spaces of learning and to have kind of balance between these different contexts.
Okay, so the three main spaces that we wanted to present to you today, that you can see in this kind of like diagrams, are the school, the Travesías and Ciudad Abierta. The school in Valparaiso, it's perhaps the place where all the academic knowledge and the academic training takes place, where we have the studios, where we have the different ateliers. But it's important to say for us that all the knowledge that we try to coin in different studios comes from the situated practice of being in the city of Valparaiso. So we could say that we use Valparaiso and the city and the acts that take place in the city as the laboratory to build some kind of like empirical knowledge to develop the projects. Then we have the Travesías that are quite outside of the boundaries of the institution and the traditional academic practice. And the travesías, they are trips, and they try to inquire in different questions about the South American identity, the continental scales, the diversity for inhabiting the South American extension, and also the meaning that presents for each student and for everyone that takes part on the travesía, the meaning that is to be immersed in crossing the territory. And the other space for learning space, or a space for knowledge development that we have that is also a little bit outside the boundaries of the institution is the Ciudad Abierta of Ritoque, that, as Silvia said before, it's on part a living community, in part a poetical place, and in part some kind of like experimental laboratory for architecture and design. So here in this image, just to have some kind of orientation, we can see a plan of the Valparaiso area. In black, you can see what is the Pacific Ocean. Then on the bottom, we have the city of Valparaiso. It has like the small bay. And then in between Valparaiso and Viña del Mar, you can see also that we situated the school, which is in the one hill that is called Recreo. And what is relevant to say is that we consider that Valparaiso is very important for us because all these kind of like praxis that nourish the study of architecture are taking place in Valparaiso, all the actions and all the studies that we perform. And then on the top, in the northern area, you can see that is in place the open city or ciudad abierta in the Bay of Ritoque. So just to have some kind of orientation about what we are speaking about. So we will start first with the first place that we spoke about, that the first learning space that we want to share with you is the School of Valparaiso, or like the school and the city of Valparaiso. And we will do this by deploying some kind of like historiographical and chronology to try to explain how we feel that we grow some kind of geo-poetic culture in the school. So we wanted to say that we are not so used to speak about ourselves and to make presentations about the school. So this was a nice opportunity because we are doing research now, so it was a good opportunity to go back to different archives, to take different images that we had the time to review. And this part of material is what we are going to share with you today. So we will continue with the school.
So to understand the present of the school, it's important to mention that the radical stance that emerged from poetry and architecture dates back to the refundation of the Institute of Architecture of the Catholic University of Valparaiso. In the 52, a group of younger architects led by Alberto Cruz, the poet Godofredo Yomi, and one year later, the sculptor Claudio Girola refound the School of Architecture in Valparaiso. This interdisciplinary group of between 10 members started an extraordinary way of teaching architecture in the country based on the ensemble between architecture, poetry, and arts, and based mainly in the acting of these kind of disciplines. And what they want to do was to extend the educational experiences to the everyday life of Valparaiso, leaving the classroom and going to be immersed in the city. For example, in this image is from the 50s, and you can see students testing these one-to-one structures, but also you can see in the border people fishing in the Bay of Valparaiso. And for me, it represents this kind of idea to be engaged in the city, but also learning. With this initial proposal, the group moved away from the neoclassical teaching of architecture that was characteristic in the School of Architecture in Chile during the 50s. And they also were engaged to the avant-garde movement of Europe mainly, with this idea of putting the artistic practice before the theory. And in the poetic realm, they were really attached to the modern poetry, specifically with Baudelaire, because for the school, this was the opening of the question of the unknown as a way to explore the reality, and Rimbaud because he challenged us to change of life. And this was really important in this fundament of the school that was written in an essay written by Godofredo Yomi in the 60s, that the name is La Carta del Errante. And in this letter, you can trace these links with poetry.
So to carry this very experimental project, the School of Valparaiso, like you have like this poetic inspiration and these poetic fundamentals, but also from the poetic fundamentals, there are two important practices that emerged that were inserted inside the academic study, or the academic study of architecture, we could say, or in the study program. On one hand, we have the architectonic observation, which consists on making on-site sketches of the city using mainly freehand drawings, like writing, taking notes, and reflecting on the different shapes of the buildings and on the different acts that happens on the city. And the architectonic observation also have another part, which is taking notes about these different actions. So we use the drawing as a tool to reflect on the different shapes, on the different forms. But what is also very relevant is to make these notes, because the notes, they represent the connections and the articulations about the information that you are collecting and the relation that you are building. So this is a slow process that permits a deep reflection on the things that we see, on the places where we are. And that's why we say that we use the city as a laboratory. For the school, the architectonic observation, or the observation, is a poetic process, because through the observation, we don't use the observation as a problem solving. Instead, it's a way of like praise the everyday life of things, of cities, of everything. And it's also a creative process, because these drawings and these sketches and this kind of like knowledge that is being coined through the process are the foundation for the development of the different projects in the studios. So here, what it's nice is that we have two images. On the top, we have a photo of Valparaiso on the 56th, where you see someone who is taking notes, sketchings, and performing architectural observation. And then in the second picture, we have one photo of we have an image of one travesía that was in Los Andes, in the Andes mountain. And you can see that the process of observation remains the same, but they both show like this idea of being in the place, being in situ, and expanding the boundaries of the classroom. So we feel that in order to get and nourish the architectonic practice, you have to expand this kind of like territorial limits.
And in this slide, you can see these different kind of drawings that are part of the observation, is a sketchbook. And you can see also different techniques that you can use to make the observation. This kind of collage is a common task for the student of the school, and through this drawing, they must ground a study of the city or elsewhere as a way to nourish their own knowledge. And also you can see that these drawings are made in different times and different space. This kind of collection of drawings as a collage is fundamental in our practice. And for example, in architecture, we spent at least 6 or 8 weeks of the semester to make observation, and then these observations made by each student, they must be shared between the members of the studio as a way to create discussions and debates about the experiences, and also to create, we can say, a collective knowledge into the studios.
And also like the fundamentals for the architectonic project. And
the fundamentals to develop a specific project, a house, a park.
Mm-hmm. that is particular of each student. So they are not doing all the same project, but the project that they deploy comes from this particular experience on the city. So the second fundamental practice that we wanted to show you was, it's a practice that is called the Falen, or the poetic acts, that they were created also by Godofredo Yomi on the 53. And the purpose of these acts was transform poetry into a collective experience. And these poetic acts, they come from the idea of Isidore Ducasse that aims to create a poetry that is made by all. These acts of the school, they transcend the limits of the school because they aims to go public and collective, as you can see here in this picture. It's a picture also of the Valparaiso Bay, in which some professors, students, and members of the school organize the poetic act. But this poetic act invites people that are on the public space to join, and then it becomes like a public act, we could say. So involves also the citizens. And here in these other pictures, there are also pictures of the Falen. So we can see that the Falen is a poetic game with a public character that is carried out on the public spaces, and it's open to freely invite all of those who wants to summon up the act. The purpose of the Falen, or the purpose of the poetic acts, is to create a poem which is made by the words that are said by people taking part of the act, and which is arranged by connectives that the poet is arranging in order to create like a final poem. But what is important of these acts is that they try to bring the dimension of being present, of being in situ, in being the here and now. Because if you have all the collection of words that are coming from these people, and if you arrange them in a determinate way, they are giving some kind of like a feeling, or they can only be there at that time, and that's why we say that they have the aim to bring the present to the particular moment. And then on the second, well, we see the first picture, which is a Falen that took place in Viña del Mar, so some citizens are also taking part of the act. And in the other picture in the bottom, we see a poetic act that was developed on the year 2017, which is performed by the first year students of the school. And it's in the open city and in the dunes. And the idea of the poetic act, it was a game. It was a game where the first year student, they created a set of cards. And this set of cards was used later for some other Falens and some other interventions that the school performed in Documenta 14, in castles and in Athens. And these games were also the foundation for the works that we built over there. So it's a relation between this poetry and also the architectonic or the artistic actions.
So we can say that these two practices, on the one hand, the observation, the architectural observation, and on the other hand, the poetic acts, are fundamental for the school, because with the school start a poetic that is not related with the literary poem, but is related with the action as a poetic act, and engagement, and as a way to unveil the everyday life. The poet says every day that the idea is to really look with other eyes the reality through these experiences in the quotidian. And these images for me are also relevant because you can see that the poetic acts it's a moment and a space that is related with poetry, but also with the disciplinary tasks. For example, in the photo in the top, this was a poetic act, but also was the moment to present a project developed by the school about the waterfront of Valparaiso. That means that this poetic act is also a moment of presenting studios about architecture. And in the bottom is another poetic act made in 2018 to receive the first year students, and is also in the public space, and the students are in this image. You can see that they are drawing, like the first encounter to the observation was through this poetic act. That means that is kind of all related in this time and space of learning.
And also what is relevant from these poetic acts is that we can see the presence of the school as a corpus. There is no like one specific studio taking place on this, but for example, the first year reception, it's an act that invites the whole corpus of the school, and everyone is like taking care of this particular act. So they are all engaged in creating these particular moments or these particular experiences.
However, going back to the origin of the school and transcending the idea of unveiling Valparaiso, in the 1964, the poet Cofré raised a radical question for the school, that was the question about the reality and the culture of America, and to a specific question that was, what is the meaning to be American? We can say that through this question, the school started a geo-poetic turn towards the vision about architecture and art, but also about the continent. This question was fundamental for the first travesía of Amereida that took place across the continent in the 65, sorry. And the idea of this first travesía of Amereida was to poetically unveil the American extent. The travesía was performed across the interior lands of the continent. The travesía starts in the southern part of Chile, in Punta Arenas, crossing the Patagonia of Argentina, and then the Pampa of Argentina, and finishing in the north part, in the south part of Bolivia. Start because the guerrilla was present there, and they must stop this travesía.
So what is relevant about the first travesía is that this experience allowed the expansion of the radical philosophy that we have said before, that was proposed by the school. And it was to situate poetry as a mean to reveal and discover the different realities of the South American continent. And then to use it as a creative resource to summon up the different disciplines. These poetic acts and creative engagement with architecture and the other disciplines were developed through concrete actions. It was not only a reflection, but they were developed also through concrete actions, as the erection of ephemeral works, light works along the Argentinian Pampa, the performance, for example, of poetic acts through the continent, the encounter with local communities, and they outlined a later collective project that was the poem Amereida. In these images, we thought that it was relevant to have these images here because, for example, on the one on the top, we can see this integration of life, work, and study. We can see the group and the camping site. On the left, you can see the tent. Then in the middle, we have an image of an Argentinian gaucho, which is a typical character from the Argentinian Patagonia. And then on the right, you can see a sculptural sign or a sculpture that was also in place and fabricated during the trip and during the year. So it was like the particular sign of this place to be there, to be set up there. And then on the picture on the bottom, we can also see how they were performing different interventions. For example, in this case, they were painting. During the trip, they really tried to make many interventions. So here we see how they are painting light constructions that they found in the Patagonia. And it's not only this small house, but also all the elements that are surrounding this place. So this gives an idea of how they try to go beyond poetry and put the hands also on the materials. Also, these two images from the first travesía are beautiful because on the first one, we can see how the group is sharing with different communities. For example, in this case, it is some kind of like rural community. They went to a school, they performed a visit. And we know that they were giving lectures, they were giving some talks, they performed some theater plays in different small communities. And we can see that there was this kind of like interaction also with the different inhabitants of the continent. And then in the picture on the bottom, we can see one of the founders, Alberto Cruz, who is drawing this kind of map or this image that is very typical from the practices on the school. That it's like a architectural practice, we could say, that you can see an image that is like looked from above of this particular place, which was the community of Puelches in the province of Curacao, also in the Argentinian Pampa. And we see how this image, which is painted on a wall, is also a way of studying the spatial conditions of a place. For example, we see the river, we see the bridge. So to create this image, to make this kind of like mapping and put it on the wall, it was also part of the study. It's important to say that the members of the first Travesía, they carried their notebooks, they were making these kind of interventions and everything, but at the same time, everything is registered. So it's really like a way of living together, but also a way of studying what they were seeing in this kind of like crossing of the South American continent. I don't know if you want to say something.
Yeah, it's relevant the idea of the notebook, because you can, if you go to these archives, in our case, you can really trace the diverse dimensions that are involved in the Travesía. That is one part, the poem that I'm going to present now, but also these experiences that are represented in the photos.
For example, what is important is that if you go to some community, like it's also something that requires some kind of negotiation to have some kind of like social encounters and everything, and all these dimensions which are not only from the architectonical practice, they really have to be nourished, and we have to take care of these dimensions if we go on the Travesías.
Also, it's important to say that during this journey of 42 days, the group wrote the poem Amereida that is presented in this slide. And Amereida, in the name of Amereida, brings together two words, America and the Aeneid of Virgilio. And the first intention of this poem was to question the identity of America. They used the word Latinidad, coming from the Aeneid of Virgilio, as a poetic openness to gather together all the realities about the continental extent of America. That means that they bring this poetic understanding of Latinidad as a way to question the continent and the origin of America. So in Amereida, are some concepts that are really relevant. For example, in Amereida, the concept mar interior was created as a way to refer to the vast interior lands of the continent,
inner sea,
the inner sea, that is represented in the last map in this slide. And the interior sea for them is the veiled extension of the continent, veiled since the colonization, because most of the big cities of the continent were created in the border of the continent. And in a poetic way, this interior sea remains unknown for the inhabitants of the continent, and also represent the territory of errancy. So we can say that the Travesía as experiences is important in two levels. In a philosophical level, because this geo-poetic vision described in Amereida and in the experience open a vision for the school that surpass the field of architecture and also surpass the traditional historiography about America. And in a practical level, all the experiences developed during the Travesía and performed in this extraordinary time to work and to live and to study together was kind of the beginning of the next experiences that they're gonna take place in the school, that is the open city of Amereida and the travesias of Amereida.
So consequently, and following these premises that Alvaro spoke about, this idea of unifying life, work, and studying that emerged from this first trip or this first travesía, the founders and the members of the school, they were motivated for a change of life, not a change of the world, but a change of life. And the group decided to create a real space where this trilogy of life, work, and study could take place, and that would support this unity somehow. So in 1970s, they founded the Open City, or the Ciudad Abierta of Amereida, as Alvaro said, on a desolate land facing the Pacific Ocean, nowadays on the urban periphery of Valparaiso, of the metropolitan area of Valparaiso. So, as you can see in the image, this is a territory, a really vast territory of 250 hectares on the periphery of the urban areas. And it's a territory where creative freedom is sought without the institutional constraints that we would have, for example, in the institution or in the university. And where formal explorations between poetry and crafts are carried out permanently. In a geopoetic sense, as Alvaro said before, the open city could be referenced, or we could say that it's located between the inner sea or the mar interior, and also it's facing the Pacific Ocean. So these are two geographical extents that, according to the poem Amereida, or to the poetical fundaments, these are two extents that they must be revealed in order to understand the South American extent. And these are two territories that are virtually or quite invisibilized for the South American inhabitants. So also this idea of placing the open city in this particular place is a way of reflecting, and it became a possibility to speculate and to question this kind of like territorial dimensions. The Ciudad Abierta is inhabited by poets today. It's inhabited by architects, by dancers, by scientists, by musicians, biologists, and designers, and most of them are related somehow to, they are professors of the school, or they are related to the school. They were part of the school at one point, or they want to be part of the school somehow. And it's in part a living community, because we have people that lives there, that lives on the open city. They have their places there. And it's in part also a pedagogical experiment, which is related to the studies that take place in the School of Valparaiso. And it's also in part an architectural and a design laboratory. The Ciudad Abierta is perhaps, if you search in Google or if you try to find some publications, I think that it's one of the most known examples of architectural and design experimentation that we have developed on the school. And we wanted to share with you some images, for example, that show a little bit the community of the school taking part of the actions in the open city. In the first one, in the image of the top, we see a concert for the one, we say the day of the school, yes. And there was a concert, and the concert is in the amphitheater of the open city. This amphitheater was made by students, by professors in different stages. And also the concert was an occasion or an opportunity to design the settings and to create this particular space, the lighting and everything. And then another thing that we wanted to share with you is that we try to achieve a dimension of hospitality within the school. That means that we try to be open to an encounter with others. And for example, in the image on the bottom, we have a visit of different, I think that they were students from United States, that they were going to the open city to have a visit of the place. But that was also an excuse to organize a brindis or an agape, a small celebration, and to invite them to stay in the open city. And we use architectonic interventions there, like benches and tables that are part of this place, that is the foutoir. We use them as the settings to organize and to create these particular occasions. So Yeah, it shows the dimension of the hospitality, and also this idea that we use the small architectural experimentation as the setting for what we continually deploy.
And about the works of the Open City, all the experimental works that are building the Open City and comes from the participation of the corpus of the school and the citizens of the Open City. And that means that is made up by students, professors, and inhabitants. Each construction is mediated, start from poetic acts. That means that the poetry is, we can say, the base of any construction in the Open City. And also is the result of, after this poetic act, is the result of collective design and collective construction processes. This design process and construction process we call the ronda. That means that represent a cycle. That means that the ronda means that it's not a hierarchical way of designing or construction, neither an horizontal one. It's a circular way of sharing and constructing and thinking about the works in the Open City. Also, it's important to say that in the ronda, participate designers, architects, bringing together ideas that change during the process of the construction of this work, because one of the characteristical things of this work that are slow. So they take a lot of time during the process of building and finishing a work. We can say they never finish our work in the Open City. And also through the ronda is made all the works that exist in the Open City, in the cemetery, the agoras, the public spaces, the hospederias or houses, and the landscape. In this image, you can see the Taller de Obras in the 70s, the first year of the Open City, and represent this way of learning and constructing, because these are students from the school. And the second photo is relevant because it's a photo of 2017. Is one work, the name is the Pórtico de los Huéspedes. And it's interesting because this work started in 2014. This photo is from 2017 and is still in process. Mm-hmm. That means that many studios of architecture participate in the construction, and others will be part of this work. And because of the time, this projection and design of this work is changing because the people change, and also the necessities and also the resources that we have to continue this construction. And this is something important in the school because it's this way of being present in this idea of growing, in this case, the architectural works. And this image represents another kind of works that we made in the Open City, which are not really permanent, but are more ephemeral. And in this photo, we can see two tournaments made during the day of the school. These days are celebrated every year, and these images are from different celebrations. Also, the important thing of this tournament is that it's also the result of the work of different studios of the school, that they work during several months to create this moment of celebration. And we can see in this photo only like one image of the celebration that is the part of the tournament, but also there is a part of celebration when it is related with eating and listening music and poetry. And it's the same relation with the permanent work, that is this engagement with the construction, with materials, and to have the experience one-to-one with the materials.
Yeah, for example, I think that in this image we can see, like in the second image, I think that you were working there as a student, and Alvaro told me that they have to develop many maquettes during a long time in order to arrived to the result that they wanted to have. So that implied also a work in structures, developing many tests, and then finally achieve this project that was a project that where everyone participated in all the school participated in the game. But the conception was also kind of like a subject that nourished the study of the atelier. Or the
yeah, in this case was this game, this kind of wheels, but in the studio was related with also with some dimension of the architectural work about building a public space in Valparaiso. That we put in relation this dimension that is not really easy to understand.
So here we wanted to, I don't know if it's, okay, yes. This is a video of one celebration of one of these days of the school, and I think that we thought that it could be a good idea to put it on the presentation because it explains quite well what is the open city, and also show this particular social and community dimension that we have in our school. So these are different houses, for example, of the open city, different spaces. And here in the video, you can see the organization of one particular studio, one particular atelier that they were in charge of creating the setting and the stage. Because that year we have some dancers that made performance in different spaces of the open city. So it was not in one particular space, but we made a tour with the dancers, and this particular atelier was in charge of this sort of movements or pointing where the dancers were. We have the poets that conduct the poetic acts, the sculpture, that's also an important part of the ambit or the corpus of the open city. As Alvaro said before, here we will see the celebration of the agape or the moments of eating together, but that was also in charge of another atelier. Another atelier was also in charge of the tournament that we see here. All the students, they have some kind of like particular role in this, in the construction of this day. So now we will pass to the third part of this triangle, which are the travesías as a learning space that is fundamental for our school, and how they have been incorporated into the curriculum since 1984, because based on the first trip and based on the idea that to understand the South American identity, the South American reality, and the connection that we have with the territory, and real encounter of living and being in the extent, in the territorial extent, and experimenting this extent is fundamental for the disciplinary approach that we want to get and we want to deploy in our school. So these different travesías have intended to unveil different realities of the South American continent. And we have performed already since 1984, 280 travesías with 280 works that are in place in the South American continent. For example, here we can see a map which is drawn by the different points of all the trips that we have performed. and also with some axes connecting the different roads that we use to go to these particular places. It's not us, but the whole corpus of the school for several years. And this one, it's pointing in the yellow, in this ring, like in the yellow ring, we can see that like there is the city of Valparaiso. And then on the yellow dot, we see the Travesía of San Andrés to the Altiplano. And this Travesía was the first one performed inside the change of the curricula. It was the first Travesía of 1984.
So in the Travesía, to explain the Travesías, we can say that it is an interdisciplinary academic trip that lasts between 2 or 3 weeks, performed every year by the student, but all the corpus of the school. And it's a trip that inquires into the question of identity, the continental scales, and the diversity ways of inhabiting the continent. During the Travesías, professor and student work together and living together and share all together with the aim to build an ephemeral work of architecture in the territory. All these possibilities to construct the work and to live and to share it during the Travesías depends of the local resources and the local community. But also depends to the places, because for example, in this image in the 84, we can say that the group was alone in the middle of the mountain because this Travesía was in the north part of Chile. And that means that was not related with people, but only with nature.
So we can say then that the works of we wanted to say also that the works which are emerged or which are performed during the Travesías, they are not something that is preconceived beforehand in the studio. Instead, it's something that emerges from this encounter with the community, or with this encounter with the place and this encounter with the materials. In several Travesías, for example, we have an idea of a destination, but we didn't know exactly to which place we could arrive. So we cannot really anticipate the kind of work that we are going to perform there. And also the work emerged when we arrive to the different places and when we see the condition of the places, and then we decide which kind of work we are going to perform and how we are going to manage to work together. But to have this kind of freedom, which it sounds very like improvisation somehow, it's not really like absolutely improvised. To achieve this kind of freedom, also there are several dimensions that are taken care of by the different studios. For example, it's the students, they are always concerned about the road that we will take to get to one particular place or one particular destination. Also, we need to think about the accommodation that we're going to have. For example, if we are going to be together, if we have like a camping site, if we can stay in a hostel, or how we are going to live and sleep during this period of time. Also, we need to think about the construction of our everyday life, which implies cooking for everyone, for a corpus, I don't know, 100 students, 1 year, or maybe 40 students. We need to think about how we build this kind of like collective life together, what means to eat together at the same time, what it means to reflect together. And that's also an excuse, for example, to design. If we are going to the fjords of the south and it's raining all the time, we don't have electricity and we don't have water, we need to reflect in how we are going to design things that allows us to build this kind of like everyday life together.
Yeah, and I think this image represents this kind of dimensions that you have to manage when you are in the middle of the mountain and you don't have water, you don't have toilets, you don't have almost nothing. You have to manage that, and it's possible to manage, but we
have to design.
Yes,
we have to design how we are going to make that. And also another important ambit that we have to consider during the Travesía is the poetic dimension, which is usually, like most of the time, they are oriented by the poets that we have in the school.
And if you look at the design methods in the travessias, we can recognize two main dimensions. On the first one is the relationship between traveling and drawing, where the travel log or the bitácora is the individual tool to drawing and to making observation about the territory, but also is the support for thinking and projecting and designing and sharing all that is in progress during the travessias. Also in the bitácoras is the object that you have to use every day to manage the domestic task and to share everyday life with the group. So if you go back to the image that we presented before, we present again because it's these drawings are from a travessia, and you can see these kind of drawings that we talk, that you can see the object of the kitchen, but also the landscape, also these faces during the bus, during the traveling into the bus, and also a table. You can say all the dimensions are there, and you use this bitácora as a way to think about the project and the experience in general terms, no? And the second dimension is the relation between the place and the work, where the encounter with the place, with the local communities and the resources enable us to design and build the works that we developed these days. And also is the relationship with the materials, because in this case, for example, in this photo, in the Patagonia of Chile, we work with wood, but in the other photo, we saw that they work with the stones. In this case, we work with wood, and we learn to use this kind of wood, which is different from the wood in Valparaiso. And these techniques, low techniques, are developed and
I learned somehow from
yes,
the people from the place, and
yeah, through the observation and through the hands on the materials, we solved the problem to build, in this case, a small dog for the community, rural community.
Yes, it's
and also, sorry, you can see in the photos that how the table is the place to share the bitácoras, to design the work, but also the place to eat together and to have more like conversation not related with about design, no?
Mm-hmm. No, it's also nice to see that in those pictures, for example, you see a basketball tabler, and it's a gym, so they were able to stay in the gym, to camp in the gym, because outside it was really cold. So also it's kind of like articulation and logistics are part of the experience of the travessia. It's not only the work in the place, but also all these kind of like peripheral dimensions that permit us to perform these trips and these works.
Yes, and it's fundamental that is the relationship with local communities, because in these 2 weeks we have to create a strong relation to live and to work and to study, because otherwise it's almost impossible. Sometimes they don't participate in the construction, but in many other dimensions that are kind of invisible.
Like the whole students, they don't participate in the construction.
And the community, the local community, but they are present in other dimensions.
So to finish, and since we are arriving to the end of our presentation, we have been quite far from the school. We have used this time to reflect a little bit on some practices that we try to achieve in our community. And it has been very interesting to reflect on the School of Valparaiso. And to conclude, we wanted to say that first, we think that an important condition of the design of the projects in our school is that in these particular learning spaces that we presented today, the works remain with an open dimension. That means that we are always able to question these works, and we are always able to reshape the projects in order to have different answers for these questions. This gives the opportunity to iterate constantly in our projects, and in the ground, this means that on the ground, this means that new ideas can always be integrated into the process of making of architecture and design. This project of making is not based on a closed projection, on an hermetic projection that has to solve everything beforehand, but instead it's something that grows for us. It's something that is able to change. It's something that we learn while we are making. So we see that this constant iteration in the school is a way of like making somehow us growing. The other condition?
Yeah, the second conclusion you can say that is that these three spaces of learning that we present today allow us to balance on the one side the more scientific and academic tasks that we have to develop into the university, into the ateliers, and also in the research fields, but also is the balance to have this more experimental and more metaphorical way of thinking the disciplines of architecture, design, graphic design, etc.
And to expand.
And to expand this one into the academia.
Mm-hmm. And the third conclusion that we wanted to stress is that in this kind of like today in a global context of political transformation and also sharp criticism, as we have seen during our research, of traditional structures or traditional institutional systems, for example, as the growing criticism towards the role of university. We believe that the School of Valparaiso has shaped its identity without leaving the institutional framework, but rather incited the transformation of it and created some parallel projects in order to keep their poetic realm growing. And we believe that these projects somehow have nourished the university. So to this day, the school maintains a certain degree of autonomy and freedom that allows to create its specific human environment that through poetry, philosophy, works and actions aims to build some kind of new reality or aims to build a utopia. Nevertheless, the same practices sometimes make the school, makes that the school is being perceived as a semetic or a closed community, distant from productivity or market productivity, and also distant from political engagement. But we believe that the confrontational posture and experimental practices of the Valparaiso School has gained a place for her to be situated on radical experiment projects of pedagogy in architecture and design in educational context, for example, and also permit her to be located in some sort of avant-garde experiments that took part on the 20th century. We believe also that these experiments like the radical pedagogies and also these avant-garde movements are not something that stayed on the 20th century, but we believe that the intentions and the actions and the resistance of the school transcends this historical period. Its continuity and also this sort of resistance has been always marked by a poetic approach that has guided also this political engagement, the disciplinary and the poetic actions towards a change of life. So that's what we believe. And that was what we wanted to share with you today for this presentation. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you have many questions and I hope we are able to answer them as well. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela and Alvaro. What an inspirational lecture. I just wanted to jump into the screen and be back to the Ciudad Abierta or in Patagonia to the Travessia. Thank you very much. And let's open the field for the question. We've got two groups today of students. Group number, let's start from group number 23. Please turn on your camera and mic so Daniela and Alvaro can see you and ask your question. If group 23 is not ready, can start also group 12. Okay, we've got young.
Hello, can you hear me?
hello.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear
you. Okay, and thanks for your speech. It's very expressive for me. And I have a question for you, and it's comparing your effort in design and in design education. What role do you want to do to play in the development of the local urbanization? It's clear?
The question is, yeah, I will rephrase. The question is, based on our experience, how we could nourish or how we could think about designing local urbanization?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to answer, Alvaro?
Yeah, as we said that in the school we try to have these three spaces of learning, of educational spaces of design. That means it's a way to really try to think about, in this case, about, for example, the urbanization of the city of Valparaiso and the relation with the hinterland, for example, of Valparaiso, and the relation of Valparaiso as a port of the continent, and that the experience of the open city, for example, and the travesias, for us is a good kind of tool to really expand the problematic of, for example, of Valparaiso and the growing in the periphery. Because, for example, the open city is in the periphery of the metropolitan area of Valparaiso. That means that today the open city is a territory of conflict because it's surrounded by industrial, very dangerous, a lot of pollution of industrial that take place around the open city. And also the travesias is a way to reflect about, for example, the infrastructure of the continent that is related with the growing of Valparaiso as a port of the country, one of the most important port of the continent. To try to answer to question that this kind of experiences that take place in different situations and spaces, in a specific workshop of the school, ateliers related with, for example, urban questions is quite important, because you can use these kind of experiences as a way to think about the problematics of the city, and to find kind of solutions that is nourished between the conflicts of the open city, for example, or the infrastructure to carry out the travesias. That means that is quite related. Of course, this is a question that is related specifically to some studios of architecture, because some studios of architecture are related with urban problems, others about housing, others about heritage. But if we go to the question of urbanization, is in this kind of context, for me, this kind of relation are quite relevant. Can I say something?
Yeah, I want to say that perhaps the experience of the open city, of the travesias, and the observation, they are not always literally integrated within the projects of architecture or the projects of the atelier or of the studios. But I think that what they bring us, I'm a designer, but maybe it's a little bit outside, is that, for example, we can go to different zones that we don't know about very much, and we can find different problematics that emerge from this zone. For example, now we have very strong conflicts of extraction from minery in the Altiplano of Chile, or in the link between Argentina, or there are conflicts with water. And sometimes we go to one place like very relaxed and naive about the situations of these places, and then we encounter this kind of like conflictive realities. And I think that that's a tool that is not going to appear on a particular design project immediately, but it's a way of for the students for encounter these situations and put them into the following projects that they will develop in different studios. So I don't know if it's, I'm not sure if I could say from my side that it's something that is literally translated in one specific project, but it's something that it goes oriented towards an opportunity to expand the knowledge that we have about the territories, and or maybe in the case of design, for example, a knowledge that emerged from some particular ways of treating materials, treating wood, or things like that, that we can try to incorporate into our practices. So
yeah, because the travesía de Open City are not experience of problem solving, but in the atelier somehow you have to manage this kind of question of problem solving, and you can create this kind of relations.
I don't know if it's clear.
Okay, thanks.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela and Alvaro. I think that Adnan Aider want to pose a question. You can turn on your camera and mic.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Adnan had some problem with the microphone, so if it's okay, I can just go instead. Hi. Hi, sorry for the background. I have a question from Daniela, as I just read your background and also some of your articles. I found your name in a part. It was like ulterior, I don't know, sites of gathering learning. I don't know, it was like a workshop or not. It was, the name was Under the Mango Tree. It was like an interesting photo as like an old historical building and actually a tree that came out. So it seems that it was like the combination between the contemporary and history. So I want to know that what was the theory and the concept behind this gathering learning, and what conclusion did you want to achieve?
Okay, so yes, that was you mean unlearning, no? The Under the Mango Tree, that one?
Yeah, Under the Mango Tree. It was like a contribution part, and I found your name there, so it was like interesting for me to see what was there.
We're invited also because of we have the school in general terms was invited to participate of an artistic. It's like a biennale, but it's organized every 5 years. It's called Documenta 14. And in this Documenta 14, there are many artists which are presented their work. But in the case of the school, we were a little bit like in the boundaries also, because we are part of the university. We try to teach architecture and design. And we were also like in this kind of like limit of our practice, which was related to art. And within the Documenta 14, there was a gathering that it was organized by the team on education of the Documenta 14. And this gathering was about experiencing unlearning and also other topics as the colonial artistic practices that we are facing today. So I think that that's why somehow we conclude our presentation with this idea of like the criticisms of institutions that we have faced somehow. It was during that experience of Under the Mango Tree, there were several artists that were reflecting, for example, in many interesting topics about craftsmanship, for example, about ways of communicating artistic practices, how using radio, how unlearn to draw. So there were many experimental interventions and experimental members of these gatherings, which was super enriching for us. And on those gatherings, we were faced to this kind of like duality between being part of the institutions and between being on the boundaries of the artistic performance. So somehow that also made us reflect on what is being inside of the university, because it brought us into this other dimension we are not so related to, and nowadays, well, at least not me, that was the artistic practices. And what we did during those gatherings was a workshop that it's focused on some part of the one atelier of the school, or one of the projects that we have on the school, that is like the design of the celebration. The design of the celebration for us is emerged from a question of a way of asking ourselves, how can we gather together and share some wine and share some food without having a table, for example. So we use this as an excuse of to reflect on these design dimensions, to create other spaces or other things that are not played. So we try to design the ambit to celebrate. And during the Documenta 14, we try to invite people to reflect on how we could be gathered together, and if they could design some sort of artifacts in order to eat or to share with others and things like that. So yeah, it was a particular workshop that was related to this course that is the design for celebration.
And the idea of art learning, I think, like art learning about tables, for example, in celebration.
Yes, because if you think, how do you eat? You say, yeah, we have a table. But then what happens if we don't have a table? That's a question. And what I feel that is super interesting about this idea, and what we were sharing before about the open projects, is that there is one studio that is always asking the same question, but they are always presenting alternatives which are never the same. So you can have like a really small question, and if you keep it open, you can always design and articulate and use your hands and use the materials in order to deploy different possibilities. So this was a little bit like the idea of reflecting on this sort of possibilities that everyone can bring to the workshop. I don't know if it's very clear, maybe it was too long. But...
Yes, no, because the picture that they put it under the topic, like under the mango tree, that sounds really interesting for me, but it wasn't that much clear for me to see what was it exactly about. But as the description, it was like it was something like the combination between contemporary and history. So that was something for me to just ask about it. That was exactly, and thank you for that. It was really interesting and cool.
So thank you very much again, Daniela and Alvaro. For the two groups, do you have other questions? Don't hesitate to turn on the camera and the microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I have a question in reference to your work, where you talk about the tension between innovation and tradition, and it's linked to this suspected idea of crisis affecting traditional artisanal clusters. So the question is, in terms of methodology and agendas like unveiling the Latin American territories, how much you think Valparaiso has been successful in creating symbolic space against suspected crises in traditional artisanal clusters, especially in Chile, and what lessons we can learn from it?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of the question.
Like how much Valparaiso has been successful in creating a symbolic space against this suspected crisis in traditional artisanal clusters. Like you talk about the poetic use of space, the actions of people in this space. So how much you think it has been successful in creating a particular identity of Latin America, for example, in Chile particularly. So how much this Valparaiso has been successful, and what we can learn from this experience in particular.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there are two things. Like maybe you found some articles or introductions that I wrote about of my research project, which is related to craftsmanship, and actually it's a critique of modern design as a way to settle modern design and aspiration for traditional craftsmanship. That was that's something that I'm working in.
Yes, exactly.
But what I could say is that within the design discipline of the School of Valparaiso, I think that we recognize craftsmanship as an essential part of our formation, and that we really need to rely on craftsmanship, because in Chile, not we have industrial design as a practice, but we don't have many industries, for example. And that leads me to question the role of design, of industrial design within the design discipline and within our country. So what I would say is that what I believe that is important with all these sort of actions that we have in Valparaiso and we have in the school is that we really learn to build things, which is something that is fundamental. It's essential for us to have this sort of craft and the handcraft in order to build things, because in Chile, like, we don't have this kind of like super big industries. And if you have professional designers, and if you are forming professional designers, and if they don't have the skills to build, for example, you can be out of the I don't know, the professional area. So we believe that somehow all these experiences are essential part in the development of skills, for example, for our students. I think all these activities that we presented today, for example, learning how to use your body and to find this sort of connection between materiality and the actions that you have to perform in order to dominate certain techniques. I think that they are essential, and they are it might be different in other schools, but I think that in our school in Valparaiso, it's something that you are really proud about. So if you are engaged with materiality, and if you can work with different sort of materials, it's a skill which is recognized and which is almost fundamental for us.
Yeah, what I think is interesting in your work is that if you look at the relation between design and traditional craftsmanship or artisania, tends to be like how design could help to the craftsmanship, or how design could solve the problem of these artisans. But I think in the school we try to look how artisans and how design works together and can be developed together, not in a kind of linear way or hierarchical way, but even how we can learn through craftsmanship about design, and not how to solve the problems of craftsmanship in this 21st century. It's like kind of how to go through these relations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also try to blurry the hierarchies between disciplines. I think that's also important to kind of like reshape these hierarchies. So you have you can learn from others. Like for me, it's always very present. I think that this kind of like conflict between theory and praxis, and the unbalance that you might find somehow. So I think that in the school we try to keep the balance between both things, and also keep this kind of like understanding that is fundamental to have connections and to learn to do, actually, to learn to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, thank you again. I think, Adnan, can you turn on your mic, or we can read your question for you? Okay. Well, I go through Adnan question that is, let's say, about scale of the school practices, in the meaning that he said, intrinsically, Valparaiso School has also a great tendency toward idea of identity. And in fact, that was the initial attempt to look for Latin roots. Such tendencies lead to identity politics, which form fragile communities. How can we make these tendencies effective with configuration of global cities? where we have a multilingual ethnic and cultural composition striving to find a common ground to live.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to say something. Okay, maybe this is not a vision of our school, absolutely. Maybe it's a little bit more like a personal opinion about what we have seen here. And from my perspective, I don't know, we have been discussing with Alvaro also about the colonial thinking. And I don't know if you are aware a little bit of that. But we were reflecting yesterday, we were wondering about this kind of like the colonial practices, if the travesía, for example, could be considered as a decolonial practice or not. And we believe that perhaps a very decolonial action is to put one person that hasn't had the chance to see the diversity of the South American continent, and to invite this person to travel and to cross this extension and to find different realities. I think that, I don't know if we try to achieve a global sense of what is the South American identity, but I think that most of the efforts that are developed in the school goes towards this kind of like empirical experience, and maybe perhaps the individual experience and the experience as a corpus, as a way to achieve and to reflect on this kind of identities. So like the question was like, how can we make the extended set of global cities? Like, if you ask me, I don't know, I don't believe that the tendency of the school is towards an homogeneity. I think that instead it's towards some sort of respect for the heterogeneity that we can find. It's not going towards a unification of the South American continent. Instead, it's a way of trying to find different understandings among communities. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think it's like that. It's like it's like looking if you make a kind of, if you look the continent, the idea is to reveal like the diversity of the continent as a way to really understand the mode of life and the modes of, from architecture to think and to design this kind of ongoing, in progress development of cities. But I think is in this way of recognizing differences, and that goes towards something that maybe in this case could be the urban development or the global cities. And yes. And yes, I think the idea of identity, I think we looking this decolonial approach is this today is important to recognize the plural diversities as a way to think this kind of globality, the contemporary idea of planetarization, or kind of.
Yeah, like we would say that maybe we're more engaged towards pluriversity, to see this sort of pluriversity among the different communities. And I don't know if that was...
Yep.
Yeah.
It was clear. Yeah, it was clear, the answer. And I think that Majab, sorry, want to ask. Can you turn on your mic and camera, or you prefer we read through?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So actually, I want to ask this question because I went through a paper by the Alvaro Mercado, the speaker. So they mentioned about this. Well, I don't know. I can pronounce it well, but they talk about like they have some live practice the travesias. So if we talk like the students in every architecture school, they can do these type of practices. But if we talk about like this paper and their teaching methods, so it's like the totally beyond every boundaries, like the political boundaries. So is it like being professional architect, is it possible for us to like recently we are working on a project, so we can't do this type of approach, to work on a city, to go there, and like, so there are some of course political boundaries for every professional architect. But according to this paper and this ideas, it's like some sort of theoretical stuff. And so I just wanted to say that, is it possible, being a professional architect, to work on these type of ideas, concepts, like the Trevesias like type projects?
Yeah, yeah. In the Travesía, for example, when I refer to the idea of avoids the political frontiers that are presented in the, for example, in the cartographies of America, in the practical way, in the experience of the Travesía, that means that is the idea of to redrawing, to remapping all these kind of political realities that are in the territory. That means is that to start to the rebuilding, to the reconstruction of these kind of layers that are part of the territory. That means that is the geographical one, the political one, the social one, that merge, we can say, through these drawing, mapping practices that are developed in the Travesía. If you go in to politics, to the political aspect of that, I think is in this sense that in the fields of architecture could be related. That means that, for example, when you develop in a professional way a project, you have to follow two rules about the politics of the city and many things. But also you have the chance, when you make a project, to kind of rebuild these kind of layers of the political or the geographical, the territorial elements to approach the reality. In this sense, the Travesía is a way to kind of start again, to drawing these layers of the continent, but is included, because must be there, the political ones, but it's kind of the metaphor of start from something that is white. No? I don't know if it's...
Yeah, I got it. Being like the student of architecture, it's a broader term, to put the ideas like this. But I was just concerned about the professional life. So yeah, like as far as the teaching approach is concerned, that is like, because I went through some other projects. So the like mostly in our student life, these are the live projects, and these are best, to think beyond your boundaries, like the political one, like there are many things. But professionally, yeah, I got your point, so it's okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Majeb. And is there any other question? Also not from the groups or from YouTube? Let's see. Well, I would love to make you a question, waiting for other students in case. It's a question that actually would love to open more than question. I would love to ask you how poetry is important for architecture. How, like, can you explain how you use the poetic word in order to create in architecture, in order to shape your architecture? And how is it important for the school?
And yes, this is a really complicated question, because I think is kind of open to the interpretation of like me, and could be different from the other, from an architect or a designer. But I think the common field between us and in the school is that the poetry for us, when we are engaged with poetry, is a way to really, we say that remove the floor. That means that the poetry give us the way to start, in this case, the practice of architecture through different steps. For example, because the poetry, if you go to the poetry, they are really in the origin of the things. In the words of the poet is really goes deep in the most simple questions. And it's interesting because these simple questions are really related with the works of architects, like what's mean to live, what's mean to control the lights, to control the environment as a way to live. But what mean this idea of control the environment? These questions always are part of the poetry. That means that the relation with the environment, with the relation with nature, with the relation with the places, with being here and now. And I think the most important thing, the relation with poetry, is this idea of listening the question that they ask to us, and for us somehow is related with the works that we develop, because as we say, the observation, even if it's a work that made the ethnographers, that they have the notebooks and they make drawings, for us it's a poetic because it's a way, because it's came from this idea of revealing and looking again something that is really common. And maybe it's conflicting for us, because if you talk about the professional life, it's quite distant, because it's not like it's not really functional in the same like gaze, but we can say it is, because it's a way to reflect about, to face the problematics of projects. I don't know if it's clear, but I think for me is this kind of openness to really start from different points.
I know, I would say for me, like maybe in very simple words, I think that as we have poetry which is present in the school all the time, we have this kind of like openness towards others. And I don't know, for example, you have also the open city, you have the question why the open city, it's called open city. And this idea, it's related to the poetic word of openness, which means that we try to be, not in a literal sense, but in some kind of like a spiritual or in a sense of engagement. We try to be open to receive others, or open to the questions of others, which we feel that is kind of poetical. And also very, I would say that in a simple way, how poetry narrates our practice. I think that it comes from what Alvaro was saying before, that is having this kind of like positive or poetic stance towards the reality. So we would say that what we try to achieve in many of the studios is start from something that is really far away from the problem solving. Instead, is this capability of reveal through words and reveal through our poetic condition in the world, what we can see, what we can relate, and then use that as a way to constitute a project. So it's a little bit related also to this kind of like belief that we have this poetic condition to sing to the reality of what we can observe also.
And I think it's important that for us is a way to pay attention to others. I think, like in another way, like because we pay attention to the poets, that is not easy, because you have to manage how to listen to the poets. And I think this is a good experience to listen to others than in the professional life, in the common life, like to really be open to listen and to try to be connected. You know? I don't know.
But maybe it's not very productive always, and in a market-oriented terms, it is fundamental for us.
Well, let's see the new word after this moment, what productive means. Let's see.
Yes,
maybe
market
we can
productivity, I don't know. we have to put many names and last names to say them.
Exactly. Well, thanks for your answer. I think there is just one last question from Samet. Samet, you can turn on your mic and your camera if you want.
Actually, it was same questions that you asked.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. I was trying to ask what is the relationship between poetry and architecture, and you already asked it.
But I don't know, maybe we could add also, but it's specifically, for example, in the open city that Alvaro was showing some pictures of the construction of the cemetery and the construction of the portico of the Huéspedes. These works, they were also created, like at the beginning, they were created through a poetic act, which involved people, where people say different words. And then in those poetic acts, for example, like we could say that it's a more literal relation with poetry. In those poetic acts, everyone said a word, then the poets, they made a poem. And then we use also this poem as a way to trace the axis of the axis and the function, for example, of these particular spaces. So maybe not in the, like, this is not something that we do, for example, in the studios or in the ateliers, but in the open city or in the travesias, this is this poetic dimension, like concrete action of poetry, it's very present. I would like to add that, maybe.
Yeah, also we can add that in the case of the open city and maybe in the travesias, if you look like kind of in a methodological way, in a practical way, the relationship between poetry and architecture is, in the open city at least, is that all the works, the buildings in the open city start from the poetic act, and the poetic act is made by people, and the games of the poetic act is a way to measure, to have a kind of understanding of the space and time of the where it's located, will be located the work. That means that the region of the work is through the dimension of the body and the collectivity of a sort of a number of people. That means that the work is really related with the dimension of the corpus, the body of the who is participating in these poetic acts. That means it's kind of a way to measure the places. At least the open city, you can analyze this kind of relation in this kind of way of the size of the spaces that became from these poetic acts. It's a kind of, the game is a kind of tool of dimensions, I don't know.
I got it, thank you. Thank you very much for your helpful answer. It was so helpful.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, we've got the really last question, then we have to close the conference, and it's from Majeb, and he says, to me, words of feeling, emotion, and person, maybe is here. Yes, Majeb.
Yeah, sorry.
You can go.
Yeah, actually, I'm very curious to know about these things when we talk about the poetry, you know, relation with the architecture. So if we see like in the open city, we can see like we have thoughts about poetry, how we can put poetry, you know, the to feel about the nature. But when we talk about the interpretation architecture, so I think it's a very like a bit challenging, because we can put poetry in the sketch form, the sculptures, but
yes,
yeah. So yeah, so if to me, like, it's a very challenging, you know, how we can interpret the poetry in form of architecture, in form of spaces, like you got my point. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think that it's absolutely disconnected, because okay, maybe these poetic acts that we say that take part in the open city, that are more concrete, and that you can try to establish the relationship between the poetic act and the emergence of a building or some kind of particular work, which are based on poetry. these are particular works, but what we were saying before about the architectonic observation and this idea that appeals to this kind of like poetic and constructive capability of everyone, I think that it's something that for us, it's like a fundamental practice in the development of architecture and design, because through this kind of like poetic capability, we say that all the students are able to develop their own particular project. So that means that if you go to the city and if you establish links between natures and you establish links between what you see, what you draw, and the actions and the forms and the shapes, all these things, all the material is going to nourish your fundaments for a project. So we really believe that this, we don't think that it's easy, but we think that through these observations of spatiality, for example, of gestures, you can create a name for an action that you want to propose, and that your building or that your project of architecture must be consequent with these observations, with these actions. So it's, for us, it's really like, we would say, like Alvaro said it before, you have 6 or 8 weeks of observation in the city, then you have a period to find the main components of this observation, and then you have to translate these words and these drawings into the formulation of one architectural project. So I would say that that's a very, like, I don't know if it's easy or it's complicated, but that's what we do.
Yeah, I got, because the most important, beautiful methodology is like, observation. So from this, we can got the, first you have to observe, and that is very interesting, like, if you observe, like, because if you observe the nature, the poetry, so.
And also, I think what is, I don't know, maybe we don't know all the schools and we don't know all the methodologies that are involved in the ateliers, but I think that what is particular from this part, I don't know if it's a methodology or this mode of conceiving a project, is that all the, like, for example, all the students, they work in one particular site with some problematics, but everyone develops its own project of architecture. So each student has the time and has the task, actually, the objective of developing its own project. So, and this project emerged from the direct observation. So all the projects within the atelier, they will all be different because, and very, very different, because they come from the particular situation of each one. So,
okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I got too much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Majib. And well, I think we are at the end of this lecture, and thanks to everybody to be here, and thanks a lot to Alvaro and Daniela. Like your lecture was just inspirational, and yeah, thanks to let us look with other eyes about the perspective of architecture and how we can go toward architecture, also starting from a word, starting from a gesture, and letting the poetry to open to unknown and try to be innovative and try to see. And then you make me think that it will be important after this period, the design laboratory, about how to gather together, how to gather all together. Like the work of Ricardo Lang after this can be something. Let's see. So thanks a lot, and we will have another ACC lecture tomorrow at 1 p.m. with Dolomiti Contemporanee and Gianluca Dincalevis. Thanks again, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.